So in the previous podcast, I said we are often incapable of knowing when we have earned enough, or that there are surveys after surveys showing that beyond a certain amount of income, happiness is not enhanced by adding more income. And this sounds nice, but and many of us do realize this when we get older, after we have had enough experience through life and enough wealth. Now we say, well, I have enough, and see a future with peaceful living. But how do we do this from the beginning, when people begin to earn money, begin to seek wealth, begin to want to be successful, and so on and so forth? So it's a struggle still. This paper argues that humans in fact do have a non-material dimension of in their interaction with nature, like the intrinsic values we talked about for tigers and wild animals and so on, and that there is a sense of cultural ecosystem services which are non-material, non-market goods. This is always an example used as to say, if there is a piece of forest, what's its economic value? You always use phrases like ecosystem-based services, food, fiber, medicine, shade, cultural value, and so on. And yet, when it comes to saving it, if you have to pay for it, are you actually able to put a monetary value on it? So non-commercial, non-market goods and cultural ecosystem services are concepts that intuitively make sense, but it's not always clear we stand up for them when it comes to that. So this paper looks at some characteristic assemblages of cultural ecosystem services. So they follow the definition and classification of indigenous community adopted by the United Nations, as indigenous peoples are inheritors and practitioners of unique cultures and ways of relating to people and the environment. So there is this idea carried forward that indigenous people who live with nature, not in a completely industrialized technological society, are somehow more in harmony with the environment, and they inherit these value system. And this goes back to what we said before about pro-environmental behavior, sense of social well-being, and so on. They have retained social, cultural people in a specific they have retained social, cultural, economic, and political characteristics that are distinct from those of the dominant societies in which they live. This, you can think of tribes living in a country like India, mostly isolated, or native Indians in the US, complicated but still as examples. Similarly, local community refers to the local people in a specific context, but not including the indigenous people. So there is local community versus indigenous people, quite different. So the assemblages include things like this: sensory affection, learning and development, health and leisure fulfillment, social vibrancy, and spiritual and heritage resources. What are the cultural ecosystem services falling in these categories? Recreation and tourism, aesthetic value, sense of place, authentic wilderness. And learning and development include educational value, knowledge system, cultural heritage, cultural diversity value. I will read them just so that you know the range of values put into cultural ecosystem service basket. Value systems in them, not monetary values. Recreation and tourism, aesthetic value. Social vibrancy includes recreation and tourism, aesthetic value, social relations, sense of place, and spiritual and heritage resources, of course, include spiritual value, cultural heritage, cultural diversity, inspiration value, and aesthetic value. The well-being constituents here include certainty, sense of control and security, economic well-being, mental health, subjective well-being, learning and capability, mental health, physical health, subjective well-being, economic well-being, connectedness and belonging, identity and autonomy, spirituality, inspiration and fulfillment of imagination. The mechanisms through which these work, I'm not going into the details, but you can read up the paper. Apprehensive, irritative, destructive, regenerative, cognitive, communicative, formative, um, satisfactive, cohesive, intuitive, creative, and evolutive. Okay, the ecosystems involved are inland water, ocean and marine, urban and semi-urban, forest and woodland, cultivated areas, urban and semi-urban, uh, ocean and marine we talked about, and coastal areas. The beneficiaries of these cultural ecosystem services include, of course, the tourists, local communities, indigenous communities, local community farmers and fishers, tourists, um, business owners, and so on. Okay, so now we can try to come back and see how large perturbations to the system affect these things as well. For example, we talked about how climate negotiations are going on for 25 years, but the emissions have not shown any dent. But COVID came and created a lot of slowdown in economic activities, reduced travels, reduced office going. Overall, there was a drop in CO2, but economies slowed down, so governments started to put stimulus funds to revive economies, but they were not being careful about the stimulus funds going to green technologies, public transportation, climate friendly activities, and so on. So now the emissions have caught back up to the pre-COVID era and increasing. And COVID, on the other hand, also exposed certain human characteristics, and this paper tries to see if there is a way to build a social mandate for climate action coming out of the lessons from COVID. Not everybody would believe it, but nonetheless it's worth looking at. What are we capable of when we are pushed against the wall and put into this situation like the pandemic that happened. I'll just read the abstract for that. The COVID-19 imposed lockdown has led to a number of temporary environmental side effects. You can read a lot about this. Reduced global emissions, cleaner air, less noise, birds and animals showing up in places where they had never been, and so their response also was very rapid, surprisingly rapid, to the changes in human activities that the climate community has aspired to achieve over a number of decades. So basically the number of temporary environmental side effects were much larger than what climate community had accomplished over the over the past few decades. However, these benefits have been achieved at a massive cost to welfare and the economy, of course. This commentary draws lessons from the COVID-19 crisis for climate change. It discusses whether there are more sustainable ways of achieving these benefits as part of a more desirable, low-carbon, resilient future and a more planned, inclusive and less disruptive way. So COVID lockdowns in countries like India hurt the poor much more than the middle income or upper income citizenry. In order to achieve this, we argue for a clearer social contract between citizens and the state. We discuss how COVID-19 has demonstrated that behaviors can change abruptly, that these changes come at a cost, that we need a social mandate to ensure that these changes remain in the long term, that they don't go right back to the old ways, and that science plays an important role in informing these processes. We suggest that deliberative engagement mechanisms such as citizen assemblies and juries could be a powerful way to build a social mandate for climate action post COVID-19. This would enable behavior changes to become more accepted, embedded and bearable in the long term and provide the basis for a future climate action. So we said humans are good at internalizing the norms. So now that we have gotten exposed to different ways of doing things, working from home, traveling less, whatever else, can we codify this into some social mandate where we slowly begin to inculcate these values more and more into daily life, so that we begin to see more birds, more animals nearby coming out of their habitats, which we have encroached into more freely into open areas, so that we can begin to build this cultural ecosystem, pro-environmental behavior, and understand the value of being less impactful. Okay, so this says that many climate relevant behaviors are habitual. Habits are memory based propensities to respond automatically to specific cues acquired by repetition of behaviors in a stable context. So COVID was not a stable context, so you have to remember that. Socio-cognitive models are widely used to predict climate relevant behaviors, but by positing behaviors as intentional, provide a poor account of habitual behaviors. While unstable habits are barriers to change, their very features, frequent, automatic, and resistant to change, also make them desirable for sustainable behaviors to obtain. So if we can switch to behaviors that are frequent, automatic, and resistant to change but are pro-environment, then we can accomplish miracles, right? While informational approaches are generally ineffective for breaking habits, legislation, incentives, nudges, implementation, intentions, and competitions, and moments of change. When you move a house, for example, it's a time when you are trying to focus on life-changing situation where you can add lots of new habits, for example, and they can be more effective. Linking behavior to identify and stay at a stable context can ensure new habits to endure. Psychological theories and policy efficacy can be greatly improved by attention to the habits. So this author of this paper writes lots of such articles on contribution of psychology to climate change and human behavior, and it's very relevant to the behavioral evolution and other aspects we've been talking about. And we have talked about climate impacts on evolution, human evolution, and of course along the way we added the feedbacks from humans to climate. Now we are in a full-blown human-controlled climate change, so we have to now recast our behavioral evolution to see how we will respond to this change we are making. So look at some more points when we come back. Okay.